The village had no name worth remembering, just another cluster of stone houses pressed against a mountainside, too small for maps, too poor for mercy. When the shelling started that February morning, most families were still inside, huddled around whatever warmth they could steal from the frozen ground. Claire Whitmore was 6 years old. She'd been awake since dawn, watching her breath cloud in the air of their single-room cottage. Her father had left 3 days earlier with the other men. Her mother kept glancing toward the door, waiting for sounds that never came. The first explosion took out the neighbor's roof. The second hit the well in the center square. By the third, Claire's mother was dragging her toward the root cellar, fingers digging into her daughter's wrist hard enough to bruise. They never made it. The blast collapsed the eastern wall. Claire remembered the sound, not just noise, but pressure, like the air itself was being torn apart. Then darkness, weight, the taste of dirt and copper. She tried to scream, but dust filled her mouth. Above the wreckage, soldiers moved through with practiced efficiency. They checked for survivors, marked buildings, filed reports. A sergeant named Davis found Claire's shoe, small, brown leather, still buckled. He logged it in his field notes. Whitmore, Claire, age 6, presumed deceased. No remains recovered. The notation was entered into the system that same afternoon. By evening, it had filtered through 3 levels of command. Claire Whitmore was officially dead. Her file was closed. Her name joined the list of casualties that no one would read unless they were looking for something specific, something lost. What they didn't know, beneath 2 feet of rubble and splintered timber, a pocket of space had formed. Claire lay perfectly still, one arm pinned, breathing shallow. She could hear them walking above her, voices giving orders, boots crunching on broken stone. She did not cry out. Something in her instinct or terror or the shock that makes children go silent kept her quiet. She waited, counted her breaths, felt the cold seeping through her clothes. Hours passed. The soldiers moved on. Night fell. When Claire finally clawed her way to the surface, using her free hand to shift debris piece by piece, the village was empty. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. Smoke still rose from collapsed structures. The temperature had dropped below freezing. She was alone, 6 years old, covered in dust and blood that wasn't all hers. She walked north, toward the tree line, because that's where her father had once told her the rabbits hid when hunters came. She didn't know what else to do. Her feet were numb. Her mind was numb. She moved because staying still meant dying, and something deep in her biology refused to let that happen. By morning, she'd made it 2 miles into the forest before collapsing in the snow. The man who found her had been watching the village burn from a ridge a quarter mile away. Through his scope, he'd seen the soldiers sweep through, seen them leave, seen the small figure emerge from the wreckage hours later and stumble into the woods. His name was Grant Morrison, though he'd stopped using it years ago. Former Marine Scout sniper. Medical discharge after taking shrapnel to the leg in a mission that officially never happened. Now he lived in a cabin 12 miles from anything resembling civilization, existing in the gaps between military records and civilian life. He'd been tracking a deer when he found Claire unconscious in the snow, her lips blue, her pulse barely there. Grant carried her back to the cabin, treated her for hypothermia, shock, minor injuries. She didn't wake for 3 days. When she did, she couldn't tell him her name. "Do you remember where you came from?" he asked. She stared at him with eyes that looked older than 6 years should allow. "Fire," she said, loud. "Nothing else." Grant checked the radio reports, learned about the attack, the casualties, the closed files. He knew what would happen if he reported finding a survivor. Bureaucracy, foster systems, red tape. The girl would disappear into institutions. Maybe find a family, maybe not. Probably not, given the state of things. He looked at her sitting on his battered couch, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching him with that strange, steady gaze. No fear, no tears, just observation. "You can stay here," he said, "if you want. Until we figure something out." She nodded once. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Claire learned the rhythm of the cabin. Wake at dawn, check the perimeter, gather firewood, purify water. Grant taught her without lecturing, showed her how to read tracks in the snow, how to move quietly through underbrush, how to find north without a compass. She absorbed everything with unnerving focus. At 7 years old, she could identify 14 types of animal prints, could build a fire in wet conditions, could tell when someone was lying by watching the muscles around their eyes. Grant noticed other things too. Her reflexes, the way she'd freeze at unexpected sounds, assessing threat level before reacting, how she never forgot a detail once she'd seen it, The nightmares that left her silent and sweating but never screaming. One winter evening, during her second year in the cabin, he found her studying his rifle case. "Curious?" he asked. "What does it feel like?" she said. "To shoot." Grant considered his answer carefully. "Like making a decision you can't take back." She thought about that for a long time. Then, "Teach me." He should have said no. Should have remembered she was a child. But when he looked at Claire, 8 years old, standing in his cabin with her arms crossed, her expression completely serious, he didn't see a child anymore. He saw someone who'd already survived things most adults couldn't imagine. "Next spring," he said, "when the ice breaks." She accepted this without complaint. Patience, he realized, was something she'd learned in that collapsed building, waiting in the dark while soldiers walked overhead. The first time Claire fired a rifle, she was 8 years old. Grant set up targets at 50 yards, paper plates nailed to trees, showed her the stance, the breathing, the squeeze. "Don't pull," he said. "Let it surprise you." Her first shot was 3 inches right. Her second, dead center. Grant checked the sight alignment, thinking it was off. It wasn't. He looked at Claire. She was already chambering another round, her movements clean and efficient, her face blank with concentration. By the end of that afternoon, she'd put 15 rounds through 15 targets without missing. "Have you done this before?" Grant asked. She shook her head. But something in her eyes said maybe, once, in a life she couldn't remember. The training intensified. Not because Grant planned it that way, he'd simply responded to what Claire showed she could handle. By 9, she could field strip and reassemble 3 different rifle systems blindfolded. By 10, she was making consistent shots at 300 yards in variable wind. But marksmanship was only part of it. Grant taught her everything he'd learned in 2 decades of military service: land navigation, camouflage techniques, how to estimate distance without tools, how to read terrain for firing positions, how to become invisible. "In the field, you're not a person," he told her. "You're a function. You observe, calculate, execute. Emotion happens after, if at all." Claire understood this instinctively. Perhaps because she'd spent her formative years in survival mode, or perhaps because something in that collapsed building had rewired her completely. She could shut down feeling like closing a door. Focus narrowed to a single point: the target, the wind, the calculation. The nightmares continued, though. Dreams of dust and weight and voices above her. Sometimes she'd wake and couldn't remember where she was. The cabin would feel like a tomb. She'd go outside, even in winter, just to prove she could move. Grant never asked about the dreams. Instead, he taught her to use them. "Fear is information," he said. "Doesn't mean you stop. Means you proceed with awareness." By 11, Claire could survive alone in the wilderness for a week with nothing but a knife and a canteen. By 12, she could track a target for miles without being detected. By 13, she was a better shot than Grant had ever been. She grew tall but slight, her frame built for endurance rather than power. Her hair, once blonde, had darkened to a nondescript brown. She kept it short, practical. Everything about her was practical now. Movements economical, words minimal, emotions controlled. Grant watched her becoming something he'd never intended to create. Not a soldier, exactly. Not an assassin. Something between. A tool that could think. A weapon that could choose. On her 14th birthday, he gave her a custom rifle. Suppressor-ready, adjustable stock, subsonic capable. Engraved on the receiver were the letters C.W., the only acknowledgement of a name she barely remembered. "You don't have to use this," he said. "You could leave. Try to find your family, if any survived. Try for a normal life." Claire held the rifle, feeling its weight, its balance. "I don't remember normal." "That's not an answer." She looked at him directly. "Yes, it is." 3 months later, Grant died in his sleep. Heart failure, the coroner's report would have said, if anyone had found him in time to file one. Claire discovered him at dawn, still in his chair by the fire, his face peaceful. She buried him on the ridge where he'd first spotted her all those years ago. No marker, no ceremony, just a cairn of stones she arranged with careful precision. Then she packed her gear, took the rifle, and walked into the forest. 15 years old, no identity, no past, no plan except to keep moving, keep surviving, keep being the thing Grant had accidentally made her into. She was good at being that thing. The war had been grinding forward for 18 months, gaining and losing the same 10 miles of frozen territory over and over. Command called it a strategic stalemate. The soldiers called it a meat grinder. Captain Nathan Cross stood in the operations tent, staring at the map with growing dread. Red markers showed enemy positions along the ridge. Blue markers his unit were pinned in the valley below. In the past 72 hours, they'd lost 16 men to a single sniper. "Same shooter?" asked Lieutenant Hayes, her face haggard from 3 days without real sleep. "Same signature," Cross confirmed. "One shot, one kill. Never fires from the same position twice. By the time we acquire the location, he's gone." Major Elena Reeves, the battalion operations officer, traced her finger along the ridge line. "We've tried suppression fire, smoke screens, counter-sniper teams. Nothing works. He's got the high ground, clear sight lines, and apparently unlimited patience. 300 yards of open approach," Hayes said. "We can't advance, can't retreat without turning our backs, and we've got wounded we can't evac because he's covering the LZ." Cross pressed his palms against the table. In his 15 years of service, he'd seen bad situations. This was something else. His unit was trapped, bleeding out one soldier at a time, and every option on the table led to catastrophic casualties. "What about artillery?" he suggested without hope. "We've dropped 8 fire missions on that ridge," Reeves said. "He relocates before the first round lands. Whoever he is, he's reading our patterns better than we are." The tent fell silent except for the wind rattling the canvas. Outside, soldiers huddled in fighting positions, knowing that movement meant death. The enemy sniper had turned 300 yards of empty ground into a kill zone so effective it might as well have been mined. "There's one option we haven't tried," Reeves said quietly. Cross looked up. "I'm listening." "Morrison's ghost." Hayes frowned. "That's a myth." "Maybe," Reeves said. "Maybe not. Intel picked up chatter 6 months ago. Remote contact. Someone eliminated 3 high-value targets in conditions that shouldn't have allowed it. Silence shots, extreme distance, 0 collateral. Targets didn't even know they were in danger until they were already dead." "You're talking about hiring an assassin," Cross said. "I'm talking about using an asset that specializes in what we're facing. Someone who can move undetected, engage at range, disappear completely. Do we even know how to contact this person?" Reeves pulled a folder from her bag. "Grant Morrison was former Marine Scout sniper. Medical discharge 10 years ago. Died 7 months ago. Natural causes. But before he died, word in certain circles was he'd trained someone. Unofficial. Off-book. Someone who inherited his skills and improved on them. You have a name?" "No. Just a dead-drop protocol and a frequency. If we send the signal, either someone shows up or we're back where we started." Cross looked at the map again. At the red markers. At the blue ones growing fewer each day. He thought about the soldiers outside, waiting to die, and the decision became very simple. "Send the signal," he said. Claire received the transmission on a frequency she checked once a week out of habit more than expectation. The message was brief, coded in a format Grant had taught her years ago. Coordinates, situation, synopsis. Compensation offer that she had no interest in. She almost deleted it. Then she read the tactical breakdown again. 16 dead, sniper dominant, pinned unit. The kind of scenario where every hour meant more casualties. Grant's voice in her memory. "You don't owe the world anything, but when you can stop suffering with minimal risk, the choice defines you." She packed light. Rifle, ammunition, suppressor, rangefinder, camouflage netting, water, energy bars. Everything fit in a 40-liter pack. She could move fast with that weight. Disappear faster. The coordinates were 2 days' travel through rough terrain. She moved only at night, covering ground with the steady, mechanical efficiency Grant had drilled into her. By the second evening, she was on a ridgeline overlooking the valley where Cross's unit was trapped. Through her scope, she assessed the situation. The enemy sniper was good, excellent, even. His positioning was textbook, his discipline obvious from the lack of wasted shots. He was winning because he'd claimed the superior ground and refused to get greedy. Claire watched for 6 hours without moving, counted the pattern of his shots, noted the slight variations that revealed not one sniper, but 2, working in shifts. They'd set up a rotation, ensuring someone was always watching the valley while the other rested. Smart. But patterns could be exploited. At 0400 hours, Claire descended into the valley. She moved through the darkness like water through cracks, fluid, silent, unavoidable. Soldiers on watch never saw her pass within 30 feet of their positions. She found Captain Cross in the command post, hunched over maps by filtered red light. When she appeared in the entrance without warning, he jerked back, reaching for his sidearm. "I wouldn't," she said quietly. Cross froze, stared at her. "Who the hell?" "You sent a signal," I'm the response. He took in her appearance. Young woman, maybe 20, maybe younger. Dark hair, nondescript features, eyes that didn't quite focus on him so much as catalog everything in the space simultaneously. You're Morrison's contact? I'm what you asked for. Lieutenant Hayes emerged from the back of the tent. She can't be more than 19, Claire supplied. Does age matter if I solve your problem? Cross studied her for a long moment. You understand the situation? 2 snipers, rotating 8-hour shifts, dominating from the eastern ridge. They've locked down your position, prevented evac, and killed 16 of your soldiers. You've tried suppression, indirect fire, counter-sniper operations. Nothing worked because they're disciplined and you're predictable. Can you do something we can't? Claire unslung her pack. I can remove them, but I need 12 hours and complete silence on this position. No movement, no fires, no radio traffic. Maintain your routine exactly as it's been. They need to believe nothing's changed. Hayes crossed her arms. You're going to take out 2 trained snipers alone? That's the only option that works, Claire interrupted. They're expecting counter-sniper teams, indirect fire, possibly a night raid. They're not expecting someone to climb the backside of that ridge in a snowstorm and wait 72 hours for the perfect shot. Cross and Hayes exchanged glances. There's no snowstorm forecast, Cross said carefully. Claire checked her watch. There will be in 9 hours. Small system moving in from the northwest. Limited visibility. Heavy precipitation. They'll think it gives them cover to relax slightly. That's when I move. How can you possibly... Do you want to debate meteorology, or do you want your unit to survive? The tent went silent. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first taste of moisture. Cross made the decision. You've got your 12 hours. What do you need from us? Nothing, Claire said. Just don't get in my way. She left the tent before they could respond, melting back into the darkness. Hayes turned to Cross, her expression somewhere between disbelief and desperation. You really think she can do this? Cross looked at the map, at the markers that represented dead soldiers. She's our only chance. Claire reached the base of the eastern ridge 90 minutes before the storm hit. The ascent was vertical in places, requiring free climbing over frozen rock faces that would kill her instantly if she fell. She made no sound, used no lights, moved by touch and memory of terrain she'd never visited, but had studied through her scope for 6 straight hours. The storm arrived exactly when she'd predicted. Snow began falling in thick curtains, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Perfect. She climbed higher, circling around to the north face, where the ridge was less steep but more exposed. The snipers wouldn't expect an approach from that direction too dangerous, too exposed, requiring too much time in the open, which made it perfect. By dawn, she'd positioned herself 300 yards behind the enemy's primary hide site. She dug into the snow, created a shallow depression, covered herself with white netting that broke up her outline. Then she waited. The first sniper, call him Target Alpha, took his position at 0600. Through her scope, Claire watched him settle in. He was methodical, careful, scanning the valley below with professional patience. After 15 minutes, he took a shot. Someone in Cross's unit died without knowing why. Claire didn't react. Emotion later, if at all. She tracked Alpha for 6 hours, learning his pattern, where he looked, how often, how long he stayed on each sector before moving his attention. Everyone has rhythm, even snipers. The key is finding it. At 1,400, the shift change occurred. Alpha extracted smoothly, replaced by Target Bravo. Younger, less patient. He scanned faster, moved more, adjusted his position 3 times in the first hour. Weakness. Claire waited. The storm began to clear around 1,700, visibility improving. Bravo took 2 more shots, both kills. Cross's unit was down to 38 effectives. Then, as sunset approached, Bravo did something interesting. He pulled out a thermos, took a drink, let his attention wander for exactly 12 seconds while he enjoyed something warm. Pattern established. Claire remained motionless for another 6 hours, through the night, through Alpha's return shift, through the following morning when Bravo took position again. She barely breathed, didn't eat, didn't adjust her position, became part of the landscape. At 1,645 the second day, Bravo reached for the thermos again. Claire's crosshairs centered on a point 6 inches behind his ear. She'd already calculated wind drift, elevation change, temperature effects. The shot was 290 yards through clear air, well within her capability. She exhaled slowly, let her heart rate drop. felt the rifle become an extension of her nervous system. Squeeze. The suppressed shot made a sound like someone slapping a gloved hand on wood. Quiet, muffled, insignificant. Bravo dropped without a sound. Claire didn't move, didn't check the kill, simply adjusted her aim point 18 degrees left to where Alpha would appear if he'd heard something unusual and came to investigate. 45 seconds later, Alpha emerged from the secondary position, moving fast toward his partner. He had his rifle up, scanning, looking for threats from the valley. He never looked behind. Second shot. Center mass through the chest cavity. Alpha collapsed next to Bravo. Claire remained in position for another hour, watching for any additional personnel. None appeared. The hide site was clear. She extracted the same way she'd arrived, slowly, carefully, leaving no trace. By the time she reached the valley floor, it was full dark. She bypassed Cross's unit entirely, heading north into the forest. Behind her, morning would bring confusion, investigation, fear. The enemy would find their sniper team dead from impossible angles. Cross's unit would realize the threat had been neutralized. The war would continue, as it always did. Claire kept walking. She was already thinking about the next cache site, the next resupply point, the next stretch of wilderness where she could disappear completely. Captain Cross stood over the enemy positions at dawn, looking at the two bodies being processed by his intelligence team. Both killed with single shots, one from behind, one from the side, angles that shouldn't have been possible given the terrain. Whoever did this was positioned 300 yards north, said Sergeant Miller, the unit's forensic specialist, on exposed ground, during a snowstorm, for at least 36 hours. Hayes shook her head slowly. That's not possible. Evidence says otherwise. Cross turned away, looking north toward the tree line. Somewhere out there was a 19-year-old who'd accomplished what his entire unit couldn't, who'd climbed an impossible route, waded through conditions that would kill most soldiers, and executed 2 targets with the kind of precision that only came from years of experience. Grant Morrison's ghost. She didn't even collect payment, Reeves said, checking her encrypted channels. Never responded to the follow-up contact. Would you? Cross asked. If you were trying to stay invisible? Back in the valley, medics were finally able to evacuate the wounded. The enemy, realizing their sniper overwatch was gone, had pulled back during the night. The stalemate had broken, not through massive firepower or tactical brilliance, but through 2 bullets placed exactly where they needed to be. Cross returned to the command post, writing the after-action report in his head. He'd have to explain how the situation resolved. Would have to mention the asset they'd contacted. Would probably trigger an investigation into who she was and where she could be found. He found himself hoping they never found her. 3 days later, a courier delivered an envelope to the battalion headquarters. Inside was a single page, handwritten in precise block letters. Grant Morrison trained me to solve problems, not to take credit. Don't look for me. I won't be found. But if you face another impossible situation, same frequency, I'll decide if I respond. No signature. No return information. Cross filed the note in his personal effects. Against regulations, against protocol, against common sense. But some assets, he'd learned, were more valuable when they remained hidden. Major Reeves couldn't let it go. She'd been an intelligence officer too long to ignore patterns, and everything about Morrison's ghost pointed to a larger story. She started with Grant Morrison's service record. Decorated sniper, multiple deployments, medical discharge, after a classified operation went sideways, went off-grid, presumably died alone in a cabin in the mountains. No next of kin listed. No one at his funeral because no one knew he'd died until months later. But there were anomalies. Supply purchases logged to an old account that had been dormant for years. Medical supplies, mostly. The kind you'd need for treating injuries in remote locations. Dated to 10 years ago, right around the time Morrison would have been settling into isolation. Reeves dug deeper. Found weather reports from the region, cross-referenced them with unusual activity. There, a village destroyed in a bombing raid, civilian casualties, standard war atrocity that happened too often to make headlines. Listed among the dead, Whitmore, Claire, age 6, no remains recovered. Reeves stared at the file. 6 years old when declared dead, 19 years old now. The math aligned perfectly. She pulled the village report, read the details. Daughter of a conscripted civilian, mother killed in the same attack. Body never found, presumed buried in rubble. Case closed due to lack of physical evidence. Except, Reeves traced Morrison's movements. His cabin was 12 miles from that village. He was in the area when it happened. He had medical training. He had reason to avoid official channels. The conclusion formed slowly, each piece of evidence clicking into place with horrible clarity. Morrison hadn't just trained a random orphan. He'd trained a ghost, a child who officially died, who had no identity, no records, no existence beyond what he'd created for her in that cabin. Claire Whitmore wasn't Morrison's successor. She was his second life's work, the thing he'd built after his military career ended. Reeves closed the files, locked them in her personal safe, sat alone in her office for an hour, weighing her options. She could report this, trigger a manhunt, try to bring Claire in, rehabilitate her, process her through systems designed for situations nothing like this one. She could remember that Claire had saved 38 soldiers, that she'd solved an impossible tactical problem, that she'd asked for nothing in return and disappeared without leaving a trail. Reeves made her decision. She burned the notes, deleted the search history, kept the conclusion locked in her head where it couldn't hurt anyone. Some ghosts, she decided, earned the right to stay dead. Claire found the message carved into a tree near one of Grant's old supply caches. 4 words in his handwriting. They know who you were. She stood in the snow, reading it 3 times, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Not fear of death. Fear of being pulled back into a world she'd escaped. She knew how Reeves would have figured it out. The records were there, if you looked hard enough, connected the right dots. The question was what Reeves would do with the information. Claire spent 3 days on the ridge where she'd buried Grant, thinking through her options. Option 1. Run harder. Change patterns completely. Abandon the caches, the protocols, the entire infrastructure Grant had built. Disappear so thoroughly that even determined searchers would fail. Option 2. Engage. Make contact. Negotiate terms. Establish boundaries that would let her continue existing in the gaps while providing occasional service to units like Crosses. Option 3. Walk into a command post and surrender. Accept reintegration. Try to become Claire Whitmore again, instead of the thing she'd become. She sat through sunset, through night, through dawn. At some point during those hours, she realized the choice had already been made years ago, in the wreckage of that village. When she'd stayed quiet instead of calling for help, when she'd crawled out and walked into the forest alone, when she'd accepted Grant's training without question, she'd chosen to be this thing, unnamed, unbound, existing only in the actions she took. Going back wasn't possible. The girl who'd been Claire Whitmore had died at 6 years old, buried under rubble while soldiers walked overhead. The person who'd emerged was something else entirely. Claire descended from the ridge on the 3rd morning. She didn't contact Reeves, didn't respond to any signals, simply continued doing what she'd been doing, moving through wilderness, monitoring frequencies, solving problems when the cost-benefit analysis made sense. But she carved her own message into a tree near the supply cache, knowing Reeves would check it eventually. I chose this. Don't look for who I was. She's gone. 5 years later, Captain Nathan Cross, now Major Cross, was training new officers in advanced tactical scenarios. He told them about the impossible situation his unit had faced, the sniper team that couldn't be countered, the casualties mounting hourly. Then the problem disappeared, he said. 2 enemy combatants eliminated from positions that shouldn't have been accessible. No friendly losses, no indication of who executed the operation. A young lieutenant raised her hand. Urban legend, sir? I saw the bodies. I saw the angles. I filed the report. What happened to the shooter? Cross smiled slightly. That's the interesting part. Nobody knows. There were rumors for a while, other situations that resolved unusually, problems that disappeared overnight, but no confirmation. No pattern traceable enough to prove anything. So she's still out there? If she exists at all. But Cross knew better. Every few months, he'd receive a message on the secure frequency, never more than a few words. Sometimes tactical observations on current operations, sometimes just confirmation that someone was listening. The last message had arrived 2 weeks ago. Winter coming early this year. Watch the northern approaches. He'd adjusted his unit's patrol patterns accordingly. Sure enough, enemy activity had spiked in that exact sector 3 days later. The ghost was still watching, still helping in her own way. In a supply depot 300 miles away, Sergeant Miller was cataloging battlefield recordings when he noticed an anomaly. Long-range surveillance from a recent engagement showed something unusual. A figure, barely visible, moving through terrain marked as impassable. There for 3 frames, then gone. He enhanced the image, too blurry for identification, just enough definition to confirm. A person, carrying a rifle, moving with the kind of economy that suggested high-level training. Miller archived the footage with an obscure reference code, another piece of evidence for a legend that officially didn't exist. And in the mountains, where winter came early and stayed late, Claire Whitmore set up a new cache in a cave system nobody had mapped. She was 24 now, scars on her hands from rough living, eyes that missed nothing, a body that could endure conditions most people wouldn't survive a single night in. She unpacked her rifle, cleaned it with automatic precision, stored it in a waterproof case. Tomorrow she'd scout the eastern valleys. Some rebel group was supposed to be moving through, might cause problems for civilian populations, might be worth watching. She settled into her sleeping bag as snow began falling outside the cave entrance, thought briefly about the village she barely remembered, about Grant, who'd saved her and shaped her, about all the decisions that had led her to this exact moment, alone in a cave, existing in the margins of a war that never quite ended. No regrets. This was what she'd chosen, what she'd become, a function that observed, calculated, executed, a ghost that people invoked when situations turned impossible. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl through the cave mouth. Somewhere in her dreams, there were still voices above collapsed rubble, still the taste of dust and copper. But those memories felt distant now, like they'd happened to someone else. In a way, they had. The girl who died at 6 was gone. What remained was something simpler, cleaner, more focused. A single purpose moving through the world, solving